And we continue with our 1-hour Newsmaker show, now on with Dr. Gary Ostrower here on this Super Tuesday morning with Mayor Pete and Klobuchar and Tom Steyer out. Dr. Ostrower, your thoughts and good morning.
Well, good morning to all of you. Certainly, we don't know exactly what's going to transpire today. I think that we're finding in all of these primaries that there are some surprises. And South Carolina, I don't think it was a surprise that former Vice President Joe Biden won the election there. I think it was a surprise that he won by the margin that he did, almost by grabbing one half of the vote, 50% of the vote, 48%, I think was the exact number. So that really, in a sense, put Biden back into the mix. He was being written off, as he himself has repeated again and again. He was being written off as politically dead just about 2 weeks ago, certainly after the Iowa caucuses. And at this point, he's not politically dead at all. But, Brian, I would want to remind our listeners that way back in 2008, when John McCain was running for president, he also had a terrible start in Iowa and in New Hampshire, and he was being written off for dead. As a matter of fact, his campaign was so crippled that he fired his campaign manager. They really cleaned house in respect to some of the personnel, and we know what happened later. By July, he had the Republican nomination for president. Will that happen to Biden? The answer is, I think there's a reasonable chance it will, but we really don't know. And Bernie Sanders is still very, very popular with a very important segment of the Democratic Party. As a matter of fact, I think that, the Democrats are in some danger of kind of splitting up, in respect to the party itself. And let me give you a historical analogy there. First of all, I would say that in 2016, I thought that if Trump got the Republican nomination, there was a possibility that the Republican Party would disintegrate, that you'd have an awful lot of moderate Republicans following people like Jeb Bush and others who would simply say, we are not going to work with this man. He's not a real Republican. As a matter of fact, he isn't a real Republican, certainly not a conservative. He supported Hillary Clinton for office a few years ago. He was, in every way a kind of a Democrat. And yet, we know what's happened here. The Republican Party did anything but disintegrate. As a matter of fact, it's now solidly behind Trump by a margin, probably 90%, maybe more than 90% of all Republicans support Trump, and they're willing to, jump off a bridge if he tells them to jump off a bridge. With the Democrats, they're now in a position where I think the party stands in some danger of really splitting up. And the historical analogy I wanted to use is one that happened to the Whig Party. And again, you got to go back to your high school history courses here. The Whig Party and the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party back in the first half of the 19th century were very, very supportive of Andy Jackson. Often they were called Jacksonians. The Whig Party stood on the other side of the political divide. They were led by people such as Henry Clay, and they were the main opposition party. And that political system, that political party system, pretty much lasted intact for about 20 or 25 years, beginning in around 1828 when Jackson was elected as president and continuing into the early 1850s. But in 1853 and 1854, there was a huge issue that divided Americans. And it had to do whether or not Kansas, the state of Kansas, would be a free state or whether it would be a slave state. As a matter of fact, it was such a divisive issue that many people from the north, including, I might add, from Steuben County and Allegheny County, moved to Kansas in order to vote in an election there to make sure it was a free state. These are abolitionists. And there were many people from Missouri and other slave states who had moved into Kansas again to make sure that it would be a slave state. But before that happened, just before that happened, Congress had to vote on whether or not Kansas would be free, or whether, or let's put it this way, they had to vote as to whether or not Kansas should enter the Union at all. And then the issue was, how would the issue of slavery be decided? Ultimately, they would make the decision that it would be decided by voters in Kansas. Well, it split the Whig Party. There were many members of the Whig Party from the North who were simply unwilling to accept any kind of a compromise that would allow Kansas to become a slave state. And by the same token, there were many Whigs in the southern states who were unwilling to do anything other than make sure that Kansas would be a slave state. And the Whig Party disintegrated as a result of that. And when I say that it disintegrated, out of the ashes of the Whig Party in 1853 and 1854 emerged what we're going to call the modern Republican Party, the Republican Party that is a party of Ronald Reagan, that is a party of Donald Trump today. And that these two groups simply could not live together. The Democrats were able to hold that off a little bit, but not the Republicans. And consequently, I think we should understand that political parties are not necessarily forever. And that's what I suspect may be happening to the Democratic Party right now. You got a wing of the Democratic Party that is very, very, anti-corporate. They view, the country today as ruled by a corporate oligarchy, and these are people who, of course, support Bernie Sanders. And then you have other Democrats behind people like Bloomberg, and certainly behind people like Biden, who view the Democratic Party as, in some ways, the traditional New Deal Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt, and they want to keep it that way. I don't know how that's going to be resolved.
Talking to our regular Tuesday guest, Dr. Gary Ostrower, here on this 1 hour Newsmaker show. Dr. Ostrower, if we could talk about the election in Israel today. I say today on our Newsmaker show. What's going on over in Israel with Netanyahu?
Well, what's going on in Israel is that you had the third election in 1 year. This one appears to be won fairly decisively by Benjamin Netanyahu, who, of course, is the president prime minister. He's been prime minister of Israel longer than any other prime minister in all of Israel's history. And so, it would appear that we're going to have him again for perhaps as many as 5 more years. By the same token, Israeli politics are coalition politics. Netanyahu's own party, called the Likud. The Likud didn't get an absolute majority, so they're going to have to piece together a majority by combining with some of the other smaller parties. And if these smaller parties, for one reason or another, decide to leave that coalition next month or next year or in 3 years, then, of course, we're going to wind up with yet another election. So there's a kind of instability, I think, that's been built into Israeli politics. And there's another area of instability, and that is that next month, in April, the prime minister, Mr. Netanyahu, is going to be tried for corruption. And if a court should find him guilty, he may have no choice but to, resign from the prime ministership. Now, he's trying to, maneuver the system in such a way that the courts will not be able to try an existing prime minister, someone who's in office right now. But I don't have a clue as to whether or not he'll be successful in that. So, Israeli politics, I think, remains very, very unstable.
The violence in India, that's been a problem at least for the last couple of weeks, if not longer. What do we know about that, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, what happened in India is that you have a president, Modi, who is in some ways the Indian version of Donald Trump. He's very, very anti-Muslim. He is a real nationalist. When I say a nationalist, to the point of xenophobia. I don't think that he is in any sense committed to democratic or to civil libertarian kinds of principles and whatnot. And his anti-Muslim sentiments were expressed in a sense politically when the Congress in India, under Modi's leadership, voted voted to provide for some refugees from other countries to enter India, but not Muslim refugees. And, of course, some of the most important refugees in the world right now are Muslims fleeing from places like Syria. So the Muslim community, I think for good reason, saw this as discriminatory. It led to some clashes, particularly in Delhi, in the capital of India, and those clashes have escalated to the point where you now have more sectarian violence in India, more than you have had at any time since 1947. In 1947, India received its independence. Great Britain, which was the colonial ruler of India, withdrew, and when India, in 1947, when India did get its independence, it led to very, very widespread violence between Hindus on one hand and Muslims on the other hand. Many of the Muslims, as a matter of fact, eventually congregated into what would then become a separate country, namely Pakistan. But before that, it wasn't clear that there would be an independent Pakistan. And so there was a lot of communal violence. There was a lot of sectarian violence. We don't know how many people died in that violence, but in all likelihood, the numbers reached over 1 million. I mean, it was one of the most violent, one of the most angry, episodes in 20th century history. Well, we're not at that stage at this point, but there certainly has been more violence against Muslims, some of it Muslims against, Hindus, since we've seen in 1947. And I don't know whether it's going to be resolved easily or not. There's a lot of, pressure on both communities to kind of tamp this thing down. But, once the public gets riled up and, religious differences can be pretty irrational. They can be pretty, often they are settled in violence. We may see more, not less, in the next few weeks.
Reading the headlines about Greece and Turkey online this morning from the BBC. Greece suspends asylum applications as migrants seek to leave Turkey. From CNN, a migration crisis and disagreement with Turkey is the last thing Europe needs right now. And from foreignpolicy.com, Turkey's border stunt won't help Turkey or Syrian refugees. Your reaction to these headlines?
You got a situation there that is very, very troublesome, and there are a lot of people who are going to be victimized no matter what happens. What's happened, the refugee crisis really begins, of course, with the Syrian civil war. And there is an area of northeastern Syria called Idlib province, which is the last area of Syria that has been controlled by the Syrian rebels. In other words, people who are opposed to the regime of Bashar Assad. The Assad regime at this point has launched a invasion of that province. The regime itself is being opposed by Turkish troops. As a matter of fact, a number of Turkish troops, maybe as many as 25 of them recently, have been killed in some airstrikes. And so, but the larger context here is that up to 900,000, that's a lot of people, folks, okay, up to 900,000 Syrians are maybe trying to leave that area as refugees. And where are they going to go? They're going to only go into one area, and that, of course, is into Turkey. Now, Turkey has barred them from entering Turkey until now, and now the Turks seem to be once again kind of opening up the gates, but with the expectation that they can move these folks into the European Union, into particularly Greece. And the Greeks, who are, as you can imagine, understandably concerned about all of this, have barred the entrance of any of these refugees into the Turkish islands in the Aegean Sea. We don't know how this is going to be resolved, but we do know that it's going to create even more conflict, I think, between Syria and Turkey, between Greece and Turkey, and of course there has been warfare, if you will. There has been violence. There has has been disagreements. There has been all kinds of disputes between Greece and Turkey going all the way back to the First World War, in other words, for 100 years. So it's not a good situation, and the people who are really going to be victimized by all of this are the refugees. Okay, they're going to be winding up in camps with terrible conditions, with very, very limited food. Sanitary conditions are virtually non-existent in some of these refugee camps, and they're not being allowed into Greece. They're not going to be allowed to go back into Syria, and I don't know what will finally transpire here.
Going to take a quick break, and we're going to get to this day in history with Dr. Gary Ostrower, longtime Alfred University history professor. Stay with us.
Court's Auto Collision.
Hi, Bill.
Never seen an insurance job we both can't make money on yet.
Bill?
And yes, I still have a free loaner car.
Bill, I just called to...
Court's Auto Collision, State Route 36, south of Canisteel, 698-9900. Online at McCourtsCollision.com.
Bill, for the first time in my life, you have left me speechless.
I am Bill McCourt.
Wow.
Meteorologist Rob Carolyn with us now. Rob, is it going to be nice for the next few days, do you think?
Well, it's going to be mild, so you can call that nice. But in regards to sky cover, not so great, Brian. A lot of cloudiness out there this morning, and the clouds are going to stay with us. In fact, eventually some rain, which is working its way through the Ohio River Valley this morning. It's going to track our way. We'll see it breaking out later today. Temperatures on the mild side, though, 50 to 55. We're way, way above normal today. Sunrise this morning was at 6:40. The sun will set tonight at 6:04. We're approaching that 12 hours of daylight. That's right, the vernal equinox taking place on the 19th this year. We'll have clouds tonight. Could see a couple of showers. Lows overnight near 35. We're mostly cloudy, breezy for tomorrow with the chance of leftover shower, 40 to 45. Clouds tomorrow night, 25 to 30. That's going to turn partly sunny, a little milder for Thursday, Brian. Temperatures are 45 to near 50 degrees.
Rob, when is it that we're going to reach the point that the snow is all completely gone and not coming back for the rest of the season?
Well, it's tough to say that, Brian. Certainly not through the middle part of the month. I still see a couple of instances where we may see some wet snow around here. So at least through the 15th, we still have to be concerned about a little bit of wet snow at times.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
You got it, sir.
Back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, are you ready for this day in history?
Yeah, I am. But, Brian, I wanted to make one comment. I was reading an article recently about the political scene generally today, not simply about the Democratic primaries, not simply about the Trump administration policies or whatever, but it really had to do with the way in which elections are being defined. And there was a line in this article. The article appeared in the New Yorker magazine, and it was about a fellow by the name of Brad Pascal, or maybe Pascali, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, who really runs the the social media end of Trump of the Trump campaign. He did so very, very successfully in 2016. He's a big guy. He's kind of imposing. He's 6'8", but by the same token, he is he's very, very skillful. And the author of the article said the following: "It's no longer good enough in American politics to run, let's say, a radio ad in Scranton and another one in Pittsburgh. These days, campaigns can carve the electorate into creepily thin segments. Gold Star moms near military bases get one message. Paintball-playing widowers in the Florida Panhandle get another. Recovering addicts in Michigan's Upper Peninsula get another. And for anyone who wants to reach a specific audience with an actionable message, there has never been a platform as potent as Facebook." And, he makes the point, for instance, that, Facebook has been under, getting a lot of criticism from Democrats, from Republicans, from everyone over the issue of, among other things, not just these messages that we really don't want to see, but privacy issues in general. But the fact of the matter is that that Facebook, that the number of users of Facebook is increasing. It's not decreasing these days. And whether we're talking about the Democrats or whether we're talking about the Republicans, the fact of the matter is that Facebook has given these politicians kind of insight into who we are, what we prefer, to a degree that has never existed before in American history. And when many of those messages are not necessarily honest messages, and that's certainly been the case, I think, in respect to the way in which the Republicans have defined their own campaign, even this year, against Bernie Sanders to a certain extent, but even more against Biden. I think that here again, all bets are off. I think that the kinds of definitions that we have imposed, that we've utilized for our democratic system over the course of the last 200 years or so, a lot of that is changing. I'm not sure where we're going.
This day in history, Dr. Ostrower, March 3rd, 1965, more than 30 U.S. Air Force jets struck targets along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was part of several American air and ground strikes against villages and roads along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What do you remember about that?
Well, I can't say I remember anything about that particular air attack, but I do think it's important for our listeners to remember that the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which extended from North Vietnam. Remember, North Vietnam was separated from South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. So South Vietnam was non-communist, North Vietnam was communist. It was also very nationalist, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail allowed the North Vietnamese to send initially equipment and then increasingly troops down into South Vietnam. And of course, the Vietnam War continued over the course of some 13 years or so, precisely because the either the North Vietnamese army in South Vietnam or the communist guerrillas in South Vietnam were supplied via that Ho Chi Minh Trail. But what I think is also important to remember is that the trail was not a single trail. It was really a matter of many, many different trails. I think you'd have to call it, in plural rather than in singular. And it became very, very difficult, therefore, to prevent the North from supplying their supporters in the South. And when I say that, I mean that, they didn't simply use, large tractor-trailer trucks, 18-wheelers or whatever, to bring this material down. Much of it was brought down by individuals with materials carried on their back, people on bicycles, again with material carried on their back or on the bicycles. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became almost impossible to really, to interdict, and consequently that was one of the many reasons that ultimately the North Vietnamese were going to defeat the South Vietnamese, and how the North Vietnamese were going to defeat the Americans. It was really the very first war that the United States ever lost.
With that, we have to go. As always, Dr. Gary Ostrower, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.